Chapter 22. Carl. Carl had just sat down to dinner when he heard Elizabeth's horse approach the cabin. She was earlier than he thought she'd be, which didn't bode well for her having had a good day. With a sigh, he took one bite of the beans and then headed out to help her with the horse. But when he stepped outside, a cold sense of dread filled his chest. Brownie was there, stomping her hooves and throwing her head around, but there was no sign of Elizabeth. "Elizabeth?" he called as he approached the mare. He didn't think she'd had time to get off the horse and disappear from sight, but the alternative left his throat dry with fear. "Elizabeth?" He scoured the area again, but there was no sign of movement other than from the mare in front of him. "Easy, girl," he said, grabbing her reins in an effort to calm her down. "What happened out there? Where's Elizabeth?" The horse couldn't talk, of course, but the fear he saw in the mare's dark eyes was enough to tell him that something bad had happened. He walked the horse to the barn, speaking soothing words as he did, even though every bone in his body wanted to race towards town. As soon as her saddle was removed and she was back in her stall, though, he mounted his own horse and took off at a gallop for the general store. He had barely pulled the horse to a stop before he was sliding down and throwing the reins over the post. Then he pushed open the door. "Mr. Brown?" The elder man looked up from behind the counter at the outburst, his forehead wrinkling in concern. "Mr. Baxter, is something wrong? You tell me. What happened here this morning and where's Elizabeth?" "Elizabeth?" The man fumbled with his glasses as they slid down his nose. "She left this morning. Someone cut the fence at the Johnsons, so I told her I had to take down her dress and close her shop until it was cleared up. She wasn't happy, but she said she understood, and then she left. I assumed she was returning home. Are you telling me she never made it?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you. Her horse just returned, spooked as all get out, but Elizabeth wasn't on her." Mr. Brown's eyes widened. "The horse just returned? But she left hours ago." Carl didn't wait to hear any more. If Elizabeth had left hours ago and not made it home, something had clearly happened to her. He made a beeline for the sheriff's office. "Sheriff, we need to assemble a search party." The sheriff looked up from his desk and blinked at Carl. "A search party? For whom?" "My wife. She's gone missing." With an exasperated exhale, the sheriff's posture relaxed. "Missing, has she? Well, that's rather convenient after last night's incident. We were just about to ride out to your homestead to bring her in, now that most of the cattle have been accounted for." Carl resisted the urge to pound his fist into something. "Elizabeth had nothing to do with what happened at the Johnsons. Once again, she was with me all evening, but she is missing. Mr. Brown said she left this morning, but her horse just came back without her." This caused the sheriff's eyebrow to lift slightly, but still the man didn't rise from his chair. "Well, perhaps she left town then. Mr. Brown probably warned her that we were going to be coming for her." "Did you not hear me? Her horse came back without her. If she was leaving town, why wouldn't she take the horse?" The sheriff leaned back in his chair, clearly nonplussed by this information. "Perhaps she met up with someone who gave her a ride, or maybe she just didn't want to add horse thieving to her growing list of crimes. Who knows? You should count yourself lucky, Mr. Baxter. She could have cleaned you out as well." Carl gritted his teeth and glared at the man. "Elizabeth is not a thief. Something has happened to her, and if you aren't going to do anything about it, then I guess I'll just have to myself." With that, Carl yanked open the door and stormed back over to his horse. In seconds, he was cracking the reins and galloping toward Jesse Jennings' homestead. He might not be a deputy any longer, but Carl had no doubt the man would help him. As he rode, Carl's mind spun in circles, imagining Elizabeth cold and afraid, or worse. He couldn't lose her. Not now. Not when they'd just started healing again, when he was just beginning to hope for a future together. When he reached Jesse's homestead, he slid off the horse and raced to the door, pounding on it as he hollered, "Jesse, I need your help. Elizabeth is missing." The door flew open and Jesse stood there with Kate behind him, the baby cradled in her arms. Both of them stared at him with alarm. "What happened?" "Evidently someone broke into Doc's clinic 2 days ago and the Johnsons' farm last night. The sheriff thinks it was Elizabeth, but it wasn't. She went to the store this morning but never came home, but her horse did. The sheriff thinks she just ran off, but I know something is wrong. Will you help me look for her?" "Of course he will," Kate said, her eyes pleading with her husband. "I don't believe Elizabeth did any of those things, and I know she wouldn't run off like that." Jesse nodded and grabbed his gun. "Let's go, but we're taking William, too." Carl paused momentarily. He knew Jesse was right. Though he and William Cook weren't on the best terms, the man had been a deputy and a bounty hunter, and he would be an asset in this situation. "Fine, if you think he'll help us, but we have to hurry before it gets dark." There were probably still a few hours of daylight left, but Carl had no idea which way Elizabeth had gone, which meant there was a lot of ground to cover, and with only 3 of them, that would mean riding hard and fast. "He will." Jesse mounted up on his horse and led the way to William and Emma's homestead. It took only a few minutes for William to agree, and after a brief discussion, they decided the best bet would be to start with the way Elizabeth would ride home. In order for her horse to make it back when she did, Elizabeth couldn't have been too far off the normal path. "We don't know exactly what we're looking for," William said when they reached the edge of town. "So be looking for anything. Hoof prints, broken branches, pieces of clothing." Carl glanced up sharply at the last words, but William was right. If Elizabeth had been forced off her horse, either accidentally or maliciously, then there was a good chance her dress might have caught on the rough terrain. Though he wanted to push his horse as fast as he possibly could, Carl knew they might miss something if they went too fast. So he sent up a prayer for patience, slowed his horse to a walk, and kept his eyes peeled for anything out of the ordinary. "What's that?" Jesse asked, pointing to the left as they entered the thick brush just outside of town. William pulled his horse closer and then dismounted as the small blue item was caught on a stick near the ground. He plucked it up and looked at Carl. "You know what color dress Elizabeth was wearing?" A lump formed in Carl's throat as he stared down at the blue fabric. "It was blue." He remembered because it had brought out the color of her eyes. They had been the color of the sky just before a storm. "This might be hers then, but which way do we go from here?" William turned in a circle, trying to find anything else to lead them in the right direction. The men scoured the area, looking for any sign of blood, a struggle, something that would tell them which direction to head, but there was nothing. It was as if Elizabeth had disappeared completely. Suddenly, they heard footsteps approaching in the brush. Each of them froze and reached for their guns, but when the brush parted and Christian Turner stepped through, the men all relaxed. "Whoa, what are you all doing on my land?" He had one hand on the revolver on his hip, but it was still holstered, thankfully. His other hand held a lantern. Jesse shook his head. "This isn't your land, Christian. It's still part of the town." "Well, the cave is mine. I've been prospecting it for months, so it's mine now." Carl leaned forward. "There's a cave near here?" How did he not know that? "Have you seen anyone else nearby? My wife, Elizabeth?" Removing his hand from his gun, Christian scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Can't say I saw a woman exactly, but a fellow came through here in an awful hurry an hour or so ago. He might have come from the direction of the cave. I told him it was my land, but he ignored me. He was acting mighty strange, too, so, gun or no gun, I'm getting him out of my cave before he steals my gold." "Did you recognize the man? Notice anything special about him? Was he a local?" Jesse asked. Christian's forehead wrinkled in thought. "Now that you mention it,
I think he did have a scratch or two on his face. Probably got a little too close to the brambles in his hurry. As for him being a local, I don't think so, though I might have seen him in the saloon a few nights ago."
Carl's heart sank. It was possible the man had something to do with Elizabeth, but it was just as likely it was another prospector who just happened across the cave.
"Was it just the one man?"
Christian nodded.
"That I know of, but I brought a second gun just in case."
He tapped the rifle slung over his shoulder. The men exchanged a glance. None of them wanted Christian firing a gun, and then William spoke up.
"Can you take us to the cave? We promise we won't touch your gold. In fact, we'll help you clear the man out of your cave."
Christian looked between the three men inside.
"If it'll help find this woman of yours and get that man out of my cave, then I reckon I could show you the trail. But you better not tell anyone else where my cave is."
The men agreed. None of them were prospectors, and they knew Christian well enough to realize there probably wasn't any gold in the cave anyway.
"We better leave the horses here so we can be quieter," Christian said.
Carl hated the idea of leaving the horses. They had no idea what condition Elizabeth might be in, and if she needed medical care, he wanted to be able to get her to the clinic quickly. But the horses would be louder than them approaching on foot, so he reluctantly dismounted and followed the others. His pulse raced as Christian led the way through the brush. Who was this man? And did he have Elizabeth? When the cave came into view, Christian pointed toward the entrance.
"That's it. That's my cave."
He paused for a minute as he looked at the men.
"Did none of you bring a lantern?" "We hadn't exactly planned to be searching caves," Carl grumbled. "Well, here, you can take mine. It's dark in that cave, so you'll need it."
Carl's heart seized as he thought about Elizabeth in a dark cave. He wondered if she was scared, hurt. Had the man left her in the dark?
"All right, we don't know exactly what we're dealing with, so Christian, you wait here. Carl and William and I will go in."
The men nodded, and Carl fell into line behind Jesse, with William bringing up the rear. Jesse held the lantern high as they entered, and though the lantern cast a dim glow over the cave walls, the interior appeared empty. Then Carl spotted a shadowy figure slumped against the far wall.
"Elizabeth!"
He ran to her side, dropping to his knees. Her hands and feet were bound, and a nasty bruise marked her cheek, but she was breathing. "Carl?" Her eyes fluttered open, disbelief and relief warring in her expression. "How did you find me?"
"Never mind that now."
He pulled a knife from his boot and cut the ropes binding her wrists and ankles, grimacing at the angry red marks on them.
"I'm getting you out of here."
"It's Jacob, the man from my past. He's planning something more, but I don't know exactly what." Carl's jaw tightened as he helped her up. He didn't know this man, but if he was willing to kidnap Elizabeth, he hated to think about what else he was capable of.
"We have to move quickly then."
He wrapped an arm around her for support.
"Can you walk?"
Elizabeth nodded, though he could see the grimace of pain cross her features. "I think so." Before they reached the entrance of the cave, though, they were met with a venomous glare and the barrel of a gun pointed right at them.
"I don't know who you are, but it looks like you're trying to steal what I rightfully own."
Red-hot anger fueled through Carl, and he stepped in front of Elizabeth.
"Elizabeth is not property to be owned, and considering she's my wife, it appears that you are the thief here."
Jacob's eyes shifted to Elizabeth.
"So this is the husband."
He shook his head.
"No matter. Once you're dead, she'll be free to marry me, as she should have in the beginning. Now put your guns down on the ground."
Carl's gun was in his holster, where he'd placed it in order to free Elizabeth. He'd never get it drawn before Jacob fired. Jesse had his gun drawn, but also the lantern in his other hand, which might impede his shot. Only William had a good shot, and though Carl knew he was a quick shot, he wondered if it would be quick enough. He sneaked a glance at William, but before the man could decide to fire or lower his weapon, there was a loud thud and Jacob crumpled to the floor. Carl looked back to the entrance to see Christian there, holding a large iron prospecting pan and staring down at the man.
I told him this was my cave. Quick, before he wakes up,
Jesse hollered. William dashed out of the cave and returned a few moments later with a length of rope. Then he tied up Jacob's hands and feet.
Let's get him to the sheriff and see if we can figure out what else he has planned.
William turned to Elizabeth.
Can you tell us anything more?
Elizabeth mashed her lips together as she thought. There was another man. He's the one who carried me here. He had long, scraggly hair, cold eyes, and a scar across his face. She motioned the size and position on her own face. Jesse and William exchanged glances.
That could be one of the outlaws the sheriff has been after,
Jesse said.
We better hurry.
Jesse and William carried Jacob to William's horse, while Carl followed behind with Elizabeth. The thought of taking her back into town when people were still against her made him sick to his stomach, but she needed to be looked at. As if sensing his concern, she placed a hand on his arm. It's okay. I'll be all right. I'm more worried about what Jacob has planned. He planted a quick kiss on her forehead, careful to avoid the bruises.
Don't worry, they'll figure it out.
As the men loaded up, Carl turned back to Christian, who had followed them back to the horses.
Are you coming?
Christian shook his head.
Nope, I got more digging to do in my cave. You remember what I said, though. Don't be telling nobody where it is.
Carl smiled at the man.
Don't worry, your secret is safe with us.
Carl just hoped he could keep Elizabeth as safe as Christian's secret.